In 2011, a young man named Jean Martinborough became a professional race car driver without ever previously sitting behind the wheel of a race car. How did he do this? Well, John Martinborough was a dedicated player of a racing game called Gran Turismo, and everything he learned about racing he learned from this video game, Gran Turismo. This is just one example of video games having an impact on the players that play them. And racing games are not the only games to do this. One other genre of games, and the genre that I will be focusing on today, is the first-person shooter, or FPS genre. The benefits of first-person shooters are a little bit less pronounced, a little bit less obvious than becoming a race car driver. And so we will be going into the specific studies and specific ways that we can tell that these games have an impact on the players. So, what is a first-person shooter video game? Well, a first-person shooter game, or FPS game, is a game in which the player sees the action of the game through the eyes of the character they're controlling. And the object of the game involves shooting certain targets or enemies. I will be arguing that first-person shooters provide benefits to the player's attention, visual perception, and executive functioning. Now, I understand that there is a certain level of violence implicit in the name first-person shooter. However, that violence is not the main focus of my thesis. I will address the violence later on, but that violence is not related to the fact that these games provide benefits. Another thing that I want to clarify before we jump in is the difference between causation and correlation. Much of the data presented in this argument, not necessarily in my thesis, but in the discussion about video games, is statistical. And the problem with statistical data is that it's very hard to prove causality from statistics. So, in order to prove causality to you today, I'm going to be showing you people who do not play first-person shooters, who take the tests to measure their abilities before playing these games. And then these people play first-person shooters for somewhere between 10 to 50 hours over the course of a few weeks before taking the test again and comparing the results of the two tests. I also want to make absolutely clear that I am not in any way advocating for video game addiction. Addiction in all of its forms is destructive and bad, so really the only link that you need to play first-person shooters to get these benefits is what I mentioned earlier, 10 to 50 hours over the course of a few weeks. So it's really not that much time. One of the common misconceptions in the media's representation of first-person shooters and video games in general is that it ruins the player's ability to pay attention to things, ruins their attention. And this is just straight up untrue. And we're going to be focusing on a couple ways that video games actually benefit the player's attention. The first of these being their ability to split their attention. So experts argue that the ability to split your attention is heavily linked to your visual working memory. And visual working memory is your ability to hold visual information in your short-term memory. So imagine that you're driving down the road and think of all the things that you need to pay attention to all at once to avoid crashing. You have to pay attention to the road in front of you, what the car in front of you, what the car in front of you is doing, what the cars next to you are doing. You have to pay attention to how fast you're going, where exactly you want to go, and how you're going to get there. Without the ability to split your attention, you would not be able to focus on all these things at once and drive your car properly. So splitting your attention is crucial for everyday life. The test to test your ability to split your attention is called the moving object task. And in this test, the subject sits in front of a screen, and on the screen is an image much like this. You can see that there are a number of objects on the screen, some yellow, some blue, most yellow, a few blue. The subject's job is to make sure that they are able to recognize where each of those blue objects is. In a moment, if this was the real test, the objects would start to move around randomly. After the objects start to move around, the blue objects would change to yellow, and the subject is supposed to still be able to tell which objects were blue. They're supposed to be able to follow them and tell where they go. After a while of watching all of the objects move around at the same on the same color, objects will stop and the subject has to determine which ones used to be blue. The average person can follow about 4 objects before losing one, but after playing first-person shooters, the subjects were able to follow an average of 6 objects. This indicates a dramatic increase in their ability to split their attention. The next part of attention that I want to talk about is your ability to focus. And in this context, I'm defining focus as your ability to block out distractors and only focus on relevant information, only pay attention to relevant information. So this is sometimes measured through your spatial selective attention. This is measured through a test called the useful field of view task, And in this task, the subject sits in front of a screen again, and this time the screen is blank. And the subject is told to stare at the very middle of that screen. And for just a brief moment, about 20 milliseconds, an image like this is flashed on the screen. The subject's job is to identify what exactly that object in the middle is, in this case it's a car, and also be able to tell where the other object is. So in this case it's in the upper right section of this image. The further away that object is from the middle, the harder it is to determine where it was. And so if the person is able to determine that after it has been moved significantly far away, they have above average ability to focus, so spatial selective attention. So after playing first-person shooters, the subjects in this test were able to identify where that outside object was significantly better than they were before, telling us that first-person shooters enhance our ability to focus. So, another thing that is commonly misrepresented in the media about video games is their effect on your vision. Many people, probably most people in this room, have either heard this said or have said this, but something that's often said is, shut off that game, it'll ruin your eyesight. But actually, this doesn't happen. Vision degrades over time with use, but there's nothing about first-person shooters that cause vision to degrade, Actually, it improves our visual perception in a few ways. The first of these being contrast sensitivity. Contrast sensitivity is your ability to distinguish between slight shades in color across a uniform background. So imagine you're driving your car through a dense fog and everything looks basically the same. It's all one shade of gray. However, if you look closely, you can see that some sections are slightly darker. These sections being other cars, and it's very important that you're able to distinguish where these other cars are. Your ability to distinguish between the cars and empty space is your contrast sensitivity. And the test for contrast sensitivity is much like the test for the standard vision test, with the poster, with all the letters that get smaller as they go down the page, except it looks more like this. Or, I'll look in a second. Well, it looks more like this, where the letters get darker the further they get, lighter the further they go down the page. After playing first-person shooters, the subjects in this test were able to read the letters about 50% better than before playing first-person shooters. Now, if you are not able to read any of the letters below about the third row on this slide, don't worry. Your contrast sensitivity is probably fine. This particular slide just didn't project very well. So the next part of perception that I want to talk about is perceptual processing speed. And that's essentially your ability to form judgments about what's happening based on the visual information that you are receiving. So in order to test this, the subject, again, sits in front of a screen, and on the screen is a number of moving dots, moving back and forth from right to left, very quickly and seemingly at random. However, given enough time, all the dots will either move together to the right or to the left, because these dots are actually making more moves either to the right or to the left. The subject's job is to determine which side the dots will end up on as quickly as they possibly can. So after playing first-person shooters, the subjects were able to determine which side these dots were going to end up on approximately 25% faster than before, with no sacrifice to accuracy. So this tells us that their perceptual processing speed increased greatly due to playing first-person shooters. Now, the third category of benefits I'm going to be talking about is slightly more abstract and complex. So if they don't make sense at first, just bear with me a little bit, and hopefully they will make sense by the end. So the first aspect, or actually let's define executive functioning first. So executive functioning is an umbrella term for a number of abilities that are more complex, require more intensive use of cognitive resources, and are deliberative, meaning that in order to take advantage of these executive functions, you have to deliberately activate them. So the first of these that I want to touch on is inhibitory control, and that is your ability to withhold your natural reaction to something. So the test for this, for example, is the subject sits in front of a blinking light, and they have two buttons, or they have one button in their hand. If the light blinks green, they press the button. If it blinks red, or doesn't blink, they don't press the button. Your natural reaction to that would be to press the button regardless of what color the light is, whenever the light blinks. So whenever the light blinks green, you would press the button, and when it blinks red, you will want to press the button, but your job is not to press the button. This is the same idea that makes games like Simon Says and Red Light, Green Light work, because essentially you have to suppress your natural reaction to go whenever the light is changed, the color of the light changes, or go whenever Simon says anything, whether or not Simon actually said. So the test for turning this is, as I stated, with the blinking light, and the number of false alarms, or when the subject pressed the button when the light was red, decreased dramatically after playing first-person shooters. So we can see that first-person shooters improve the subject's ability to inhibit their natural reactions if they so choose. The next aspect of executive functioning I want to talk about is a little bit more straightforward. It's task switching. And that's much like what it sounds like. It's your ability to switch between doing one task and another without either of the tasks suffering at all. So imagine you're driving down the road again, and you're paying attention to the road, except then a song comes on that you don't really like, and so you want to switch the song. So you look down at your phone or at the radio, and you change the song, or you change channels, and then you switch back to focusing on the road. Except you want to be able to switch back to the road as quickly as you possibly can, and once you switch back, you don't want to be any worse at driving than you were before you switched. So, in order to test a person's ability to switch tasks, there's something called the number-letter pair test, in which the subject is sitting in front of a screen, and on the screen there is a number and a letter. And the subject has two buttons in their hands. If the letter is a vowel, they press the left button, and if it's a consonant, they press the right button. and then a new pair of numbers and a new number letter pair will appear on the screen, and they do the same thing, and so on and so on. Except at some point, they have to switch from focusing on the letter and start looking at the number. And if the number at this point is odd, they press the left button. And if it's even, they press the right button. In studies comparing people before and after playing first-person shooters, the overall reaction time of these people didn't actually change much between before playing and after playing. But after switching tasks, before playing at first-person shooters, their reaction time suffered much, much more than it did after playing first-person shooters. So we can see from this that first-person shooters definitely improve the player's ability to switch tasks. Now, at the beginning of my thesis, I talked about how you might be worried about the violent aspect of first-person shooters, and that I would address it later. Well, I don't have a whole lot of time, but I'm going to do my very best to address your potential concerns at this point. So, much of video games representation in the media is that they cause people to be more violent, or at least make it more likely that you will commit violent actions. However, if we look at the statistics for this, it's simply untrue. But what do we mean when we're talking about violence in this context? Well, it's nearly impossible to study violence in a lab setting, and so all the data for this specific topic is statistical. And it is comparing violent video game use to violent crime. So, when looking at these statistics, we can see that, or if violent games caused violent crime, you would expect that the popularity of violent video games, as it went up, you'd expect violent crime to also go up. However, if we look at the statistics, the opposite is true. Violent video games have steadily been becoming more popular since video games' conception, and violent crime has been going down, or at sometimes has seemed unrelated to the trend of violent video games at all. So we can see that, at the very least, violent video games have no bearing on violent crime at all. And if there is any connection, it is actually inverse to what we commonly hear portrayed. Not only that, but in a study comparing violent crime in countries to those countries' consumption of violent video games, in all the countries where violent games were most popular, violent crime was least common. And this study was controlled for a number of variables, because obviously this type of study has all sorts of variables. So this study was controlled in all sorts of ways, and no matter which way they ran it, all the countries where violent video games were the most popular had the least amount of violent crime. So in conclusion, you may not become a race car driver like John Martinborough, but playing first-person shooters will definitely improve your cognitive abilities and make you better at everyday tasks. So if you or someone you know plays first-person shooters, don't worry. They're not going to develop ADD or lose their eyesight or lose all semblance of self-control. And they're definitely not going to become a violent criminal. Trust me, I've been playing violent video games for most of my life, and I've never committed a violent crime. I've never been convicted of a violent crime. I would even go so far as to recommend that you give first-person shooters a try for yourself. Your cognitive abilities will improve, and you may even find that you have a little bit of fun along the way. Thank you.
Bryce, well done. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Roth.